Chapter 1. Caligula, the emperor who made his horse, a consul and declared war on Neptune. Gaius Julius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus, better known to history as Caligula, ascended to the Roman throne in 37 AD as a seemingly promising young ruler who had captured the hearts of the Roman people through his charismatic personality and his connection to the beloved military hero Germanicus. But within months of gaining absolute power over the largest empire in the ancient world, this initially popular emperor would descend into a spiral of madness, cruelty, and bizarre behavior that would transform him into one of history's most notorious examples of how unlimited power can corrupt even the most promising individuals and create monsters whose actions defy rational explanation or moral comprehension. The transformation of Caligula from a beloved prince to a despotic madman began almost immediately after his coronation, as the young emperor quickly developed an obsession with his own divinity that led him to demand worship from his subjects, construct elaborate temples dedicated to himself, and insist that even the most senior senators prostrate themselves before him in rituals that were previously reserved for the gods themselves. This megalomaniacal behavior was not merely eccentric, but represented a fundamental break with Roman tradition and constitutional government that threatened the very foundations of the empire and demonstrated how absolute power could transform a human being into something that was no longer recognizably human. The case of Caligula's relationship with his favorite horse, Incitatus, illustrates the emperor's complete disconnection from reality and his contempt for the Roman political system, as he not only appointed the animal to the position of consul, but also built elaborate stables lined with marble, provided the horse with a retinue of servants, and reportedly planned to make the animal a full senator with voting rights in the Roman government. This bizarre appointment was not merely a joke or political statement, but reflected Caligula's genuine belief that a horse was more qualified to govern than the experienced politicians and military leaders who had built and maintained the Roman Empire for centuries. The emperor's sexual depravity knew no bounds, as historical records document his incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters. His practice of forcing senators' wives to participate in orgies while their husbands watched, and his establishment of a brothel within the imperial palace where he prostituted the wives and daughters of Rome's most prominent families to raise money for his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. These sexual crimes were not private matters, but public humiliations designed to demonstrate his absolute power over the lives and dignity of his subjects, while satisfying his twisted psychological needs for domination and degradation. The case of Caligula's military campaigns reveals the emperor's complete incompetence as a military leader and his willingness to waste enormous resources on pointless exercises that served no strategic purpose beyond feeding his own ego and delusions of grandeur. His famous war against the sea god Neptune involved ordering his legions to march to the English Channel and collect seashells as spoils of war, while his planned invasion of Britain was abandoned when the emperor became distracted by other projects, leaving thousands of soldiers stranded without purpose or direction, while enormous sums were wasted on military preparations that served no rational objective. The emperor's financial irresponsibility was staggering in its scope and consequences, as he managed to squander the enormous treasury surplus that had been accumulated by his predecessor Tiberius within less than a year of taking power, spending vast sums on gladiatorial games, public spectacles, and personal luxuries, while ignoring the essential functions of government and military defense that required sustained funding. His solution to the resulting financial crisis was to implement increasingly desperate and arbitrary taxation schemes, including taxes on lawsuits, marriages, and even prostitution, while seizing property from wealthy citizens through trumped-up charges and forced inheritances. The case of Caligula's treatment of the Roman Senate demonstrates his complete contempt for republican institutions and constitutional government, as he regularly humiliated senators by forcing them to run alongside his chariot for miles, made them serve as his personal servants during banquets, and threatened to have them executed for trivial offenses or imaginary slights. His famous declaration that he wished the Roman people had only one neck so that he could cut it with a single blow reveals the depth of his hatred for the very people he was supposed to serve and protect as their emperor. The emperor's religious innovations were as bizarre as they were blasphemous, as he not only declared himself a living god, but also engaged in elaborate conversations with statues of Jupiter and other deities, claimed to receive direct communications from the gods through dreams and visions, and established new religious rituals that required citizens to worship him as the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon. These religious delusions were not merely personal eccentricities, but represented a fundamental challenge to traditional Roman religion and social order that threatened to undermine the cultural foundations of the empire. The case of Caligula's architectural projects reveals his grandiose delusions and his willingness to waste enormous resources on monuments to his own ego, including plans for a bridge across the Bay of Naples that would have been longer than the distance from Rome to the sea, a palace that would have extended from Rome to the Bay of Naples, and a temple to himself that would have been larger than any existing religious structure in the ancient world. These projects were not merely expensive, but represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of government and the responsibilities of leadership. The emperor's judicial system was characterized by arbitrary cruelty and complete disregard for legal precedent or due process, as he regularly ordered executions based on personal whims, dreams, or imaginary offenses, while pardoning genuine criminals who flattered his ego or amused him with their antics. His practice of forcing parents to attend the executions of their children and then inviting them to dinner immediately afterward demonstrates a level of psychological sadism that defies rational explanation and reveals the complete absence of human empathy or moral restraint. The case of Caligula's relationship with his Praetorian Guard illustrates how his erratic behavior and cruel treatment of subordinates ultimately led to his downfall, as even the soldiers who were supposed to protect him became convinced that he posed a greater threat to the empire than any external enemy. The conspiracy that ultimately resulted in his assassination was not the product of political opposition or military rebellion, but rather the desperate action of individuals who recognized that the emperor's continued rule would lead to the complete destruction of the Roman state and society. The emperor's treatment of foreign dignitaries and diplomatic relations reveals his complete inability to understand the complexities of international politics and his tendency to create unnecessary conflicts through personal insults and bizarre demands that alienated potential allies while strengthening enemies. His demand that foreign kings worship him as a god and his practice of humiliating ambassadors through elaborate practical jokes demonstrated a level of diplomatic incompetence that threatened the security and stability of the entire empire. The case of Caligula's final months in power shows a ruler who had become completely disconnected from reality and was actively planning even more extreme and destructive policies, including the relocation of the imperial capital to Alexandria, the systematic execution of all remaining members of the Roman aristocracy, and the establishment of a new form of government based entirely on his personal whims and divine revelations. These plans, which were only prevented by his assassination, demonstrate how unchecked power and mental illness could combine to create threats to civilization itself. The psychological analysis of Caligula's behavior suggests a complex combination of mental illness, childhood trauma, and the corrupting effects of absolute power that transformed a potentially capable ruler into a monster whose actions threatened the survival of one of history's greatest civilizations. His case provides important insights into the dangers of concentrated power and the importance of institutional checks and balances that can prevent individual pathology from destroying entire societies. The legacy of Caligula's brief but catastrophic reign extends far beyond the immediate damage he inflicted on the Roman Empire to provide enduring lessons about the nature of power, the importance of constitutional government, and the dangers of allowing individual leaders to operate without effective oversight or accountability. His example has been studied by political theorists and historians for nearly 2 millennia as a cautionary tale about the potential for human nature to be corrupted by unlimited authority and the importance of institutional safeguards that can protect society from the consequences of individual madness or moral failure. As we examine the full scope of Caligula's destructive reign and its consequences for the Roman Empire and subsequent history, it becomes clear that his case represents one of the most extreme examples of how personal pathology and unlimited power can combine to create threats to civilization itself, demonstrating the importance of understanding the psychological and institutional factors that can prevent or enable such catastrophic leadership failures in any society or historical period. Chapter 2. Henry VIII, the wife-killing tyrant who destroyed England's soul for personal pleasure. Henry VIII of England began his reign in 1509 as a Renaissance prince who embodied the highest ideals of Christian kingship, scholarly achievement, and chivalric virtue. But over the course of his 38-year rule, this initially promising monarch would transform into a bloated, paranoid, and murderous tyrant whose insatiable appetite for power, sexual gratification, and personal validation would lead him to destroy England's religious traditions, execute 2 of his 6 wives, and establish patterns of royal absolutism that would plague English politics for generations, while leaving a trail of broken lives and institutional destruction that fundamentally altered the character of English civilization. The king's obsession with producing a male heir became the driving force behind increasingly desperate and destructive decisions that would ultimately cost thousands of lives and tear apart the fabric of English society, as his determination to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, led him to break with the Roman Catholic Church, establish himself as the supreme head of the Church of England, and initiate a religious revolution that would divide families, destroy ancient institutions, and create religious conflicts that would persist for centuries. This personal obsession with dynastic succession transformed what should have been a private marital matter into a national catastrophe that affected every aspect of English life and demonstrated how royal selfishness could destroy the stability and unity of an entire kingdom. The case of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, illustrates the king's capacity for both passionate obsession and cold-blooded murder, as he pursued her for years with romantic letters and lavish gifts, defied the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor to marry her, and then had her executed on trumped-up charges of adultery, incest, and treason when she failed to produce the male heir he demanded. The speed with which Henry turned from devoted lover to executioner reveals a personality that was capable of extreme emotional swings and demonstrates how his personal desires always took precedence over justice, mercy, or basic human decency. The king's treatment of Thomas More, his former friend and Lord Chancellor, demonstrates the ruthless manner in which Henry eliminated anyone who opposed his will, even those who had served him faithfully for years and whose only crime was maintaining their religious convictions in the face of royal pressure. More's execution for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the Church of England sent a clear message that personal loyalty, intellectual achievement, and moral integrity meant nothing to a king who demanded absolute submission to his will, regardless of the consequences for individual conscience or religious belief. The case of the dissolution of the monasteries reveals Henry's willingness to destroy centuries-old religious institutions and steal their wealth to fund his personal extravagances and political ambitions, as he systematically closed over 800 monasteries, confiscated their lands and treasures, and left thousands of monks and nuns homeless while destroying libraries, artworks, and architectural treasures that represented irreplaceable cultural heritage. This massive act of institutional vandalism was justified as religious reform, but was actually motivated by Henry's desperate need for money to fund his wars and his increasingly lavish lifestyle. The king's physical transformation from an athletic and handsome young man into a grotesquely obese and diseased invalid reflects the moral and spiritual corruption that characterized his reign, as his inability to control his appetites for food, alcohol, and sexual pleasure paralleled his inability to exercise restraint in matters of state and personal relationships. By the end of his reign, Henry weighed over 300 pounds, suffered from painful leg ulcers that never healed, and required mechanical assistance to move around his palaces, creating a physical embodiment of the moral decay that had consumed his character and his kingdom. The case of Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, demonstrates the king's predatory behavior toward young women and his willingness to execute even teenage girls who failed to meet his impossible standards of perfection and submission. Catherine was barely 20 years old when Henry had her executed for adultery, and the evidence suggests that she was more victim than criminal, having been manipulated by older courtiers and thrust into a position where she had no real power or protection from the king's paranoid suspicions and violent temper. The king's foreign policy was characterized by expensive and pointless wars that drained England's treasury and accomplished nothing beyond satisfying Henry's personal vanity and his desire to be recognized as a major European power, as his invasions of France achieved no lasting territorial gains while costing enormous sums that could have been used for domestic improvements and social welfare. These military adventures were motivated more by Henry's need for personal glory than by any rational assessment of English national interests, demonstrating how royal ego could override practical considerations of statecraft and fiscal responsibility. The case of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a popular uprising against Henry's religious policies, reveals the king's willingness to use deception and mass murder to maintain his power, as he initially promised pardons to the rebels and then systematically executed their leaders in violation of his sworn word. The brutal suppression of this rebellion, which involved the execution of over 200 people, including priests, nobles, and common folk, demonstrated that Henry's word was worthless and that he would stop at nothing to maintain his absolute authority over his subjects. The king's treatment of his own family members reveals a level of cruelty and paranoia that extended even to his closest relatives, as he had his own niece, Margaret Pole, executed at the age of 67 for the crime of being related to potential claimants to the throne, while keeping his own daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, in a state of legal limbo that denied them recognition as legitimate heirs for years. This willingness to destroy family relationships for political advantage demonstrates how Henry's pursuit of power had corrupted even the most basic human bonds of kinship and affection. The case of Henry's relationship with Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister for nearly a decade, illustrates the king's tendency to use and discard even his most loyal servants when they no longer served his immediate purposes, as he had Cromwell executed on charges of treason after the minister had faithfully implemented the king's policies and accumulated enormous wealth and power on his behalf. Cromwell's fall demonstrates that no one, regardless of their service or loyalty, was safe from Henry's paranoid suspicions and his willingness to sacrifice anyone who might pose a threat to his absolute authority. The king's impact on English culture and intellectual life was largely destructive, as his break with Rome cut England off from the broader European intellectual community, while his persecution of scholars and religious thinkers created an atmosphere of fear and conformity that stifled creativity and independent thought. The destruction of monastic libraries and schools eliminated important centers of learning and scholarship, while the climate of religious persecution discouraged the kind of open inquiry and debate that had characterized earlier periods of English intellectual achievement. The case of Henry's final years reveals a ruler who had become increasingly isolated, paranoid, and physically repulsive, surrounded by courtiers who lived in constant fear of his unpredictable rages and violent outbursts, while the kingdom suffered from the accumulated effects of decades of misrule, religious conflict, and financial irresponsibility. The king's death in 1547 was reportedly greeted with relief by many of his subjects, who had grown weary of living under the constant threat of royal violence and arbitrary punishment. The long-term consequences of Henry's reign extended far beyond his own lifetime to shape English history for centuries, as the religious divisions he created would lead to decades of civil conflict, persecution, and political instability, while the precedents he established for royal absolutism would contribute to the constitutional crises that would eventually result in civil war and the execution of his great-great-grandson, Charles I. The institutional damage that Henry inflicted on English society required generations to repair, and in some cases was never fully reversed. The psychological analysis of Henry's character reveals a complex combination of narcissistic personality disorder, paranoid tendencies, and the corrupting effects of absolute power that transformed a potentially capable ruler into a destructive force that threatened the stability and welfare of his entire kingdom. His case provides important insights into the dangers of concentrated power and the importance of institutional constraints that can prevent individual pathology from destroying entire societies. The international impact of Henry's reign was largely negative, as his break with Rome isolated England from the broader European community, while his aggressive foreign policy and unreliable diplomacy made him a difficult and dangerous ally who could not be trusted to honor his commitments or maintain consistent policies. The religious conflicts that Henry initiated would eventually spread throughout Europe and contribute to centuries of warfare and persecution that affected millions of people. As we examine the full scope of Henry VIII's destructive reign and its lasting consequences for English society and European civilization, it becomes clear that his case represents one of the most dramatic examples of how personal pathology and unlimited power can combine to create catastrophic leadership that destroys the very foundations of civilized society, while leaving legacies of conflict and institutional damage that persist for generations beyond the individual ruler's lifetime. Chapter 3. Nero, the singing emperor who burned Rome and murdered his own mother. Nero, Claudius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus ascended to the Roman throne in 54 AD at the age of 16, initially guided by competent advisors and showing promise as a ruler who might restore stability and prosperity to an empire that had suffered under the erratic leadership of his predecessor Caligula. But within a few years of gaining power, this young emperor would reveal himself to be one of history's most narcissistic, cruel, and destructive rulers, whose obsession with artistic performance, sexual depravity, and personal gratification would lead him to commit matricide, burn down much of Rome, and engage in such extreme behavior that he would become synonymous with tyrannical excess and moral corruption for over 2 millennia. The emperor's relationship with his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who had orchestrated his rise to power through political manipulation and possibly the murder of his predecessor Claudius, quickly deteriorated into a deadly power struggle that would culminate in one of the most shocking crimes in Roman history, as Nero became increasingly resentful of his mother's attempts to control his decisions and influence his policies, leading him to plot her assassination through increasingly elaborate and bizarre schemes that revealed both his cowardice and his complete lack of filial affection or basic human decency. The case of Agrippina's murder demonstrates Nero's capacity for both elaborate planning and shocking brutality, as he first attempted to kill her with a collapsible boat designed to sink and drown her during what was supposed to be a pleasure cruise. And when that scheme failed because she swam to shore, he simply sent soldiers to her villa to stab her to death, while she reportedly bared her womb and told them to strike where she had carried the ungrateful son who was now trying to murder her. This matricide shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy and marked the beginning of Nero's transformation from a potentially competent ruler into a monster who recognized no moral or legal constraints on his behavior. The emperor's obsession with artistic performance, particularly singing and acting, led him to neglect the essential duties of government while forcing the Roman elite to attend his lengthy and mediocre performances, where they were required to applaud enthusiastically under threat of punishment or death, creating a bizarre spectacle where the ruler of the world's greatest empire spent his time pursuing personal vanity projects, while the real business of governing was left to subordinates or ignored entirely. Nero's participation in public theatrical performances violated fundamental Roman social norms that considered such activities beneath the dignity of aristocrats, let alone emperors, demonstrating his complete disconnection from traditional values and social expectations. The case of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which destroyed much of the city and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless, has been forever associated with Nero's alleged response of playing his lyre and singing while the city burned. Though historical evidence suggests that he was actually in Antium when the fire started and did return to organize relief efforts, the popular perception of his callous indifference to his subjects' suffering reflects the broader pattern of selfishness and cruelty that characterized his reign and made such stories believable to contemporary observers. The emperor's response to the fire's aftermath reveals his true priorities and character, as he used the disaster as an opportunity to seize vast areas of the city for the construction of his enormous Golden House, a palace complex that would have covered over 300 acres in the heart of Rome, and included artificial lakes, elaborate gardens, and a 120-foot-tall statue of himself, demonstrating that he viewed the suffering of his subjects primarily as an opportunity to aggrandize himself and satisfy his megalomaniacal fantasies rather than as a tragedy requiring compassionate leadership and practical solutions. The case of Nero's persecution of Christians, whom he blamed for the Great Fire, despite the lack of any credible evidence, reveals his willingness to scapegoat innocent people to deflect criticism from his own failures, while satisfying his sadistic impulses through elaborate and cruel forms of execution that included crucifixion, burning alive, and being torn apart by wild animals in the arena. These persecutions were not motivated by religious conviction or political necessity, but by Nero's need to find victims for his cruelty while diverting public attention from his own incompetence and moral failures. The emperor's sexual behavior was characterized by extreme depravity and violence that shocked even the permissive standards of Roman society, as he reportedly castrated and married a young man named Sporus, who resembled his deceased wife Poppaea, forced senators' wives to participate in orgies, and engaged in public sexual acts that violated every norm of imperial dignity and social propriety. These sexual crimes were not private matters, but public demonstrations of his power over his subjects' bodies and dignity, revealing a personality that derived pleasure from humiliation and domination rather than genuine intimacy or affection. The case of Nero's treatment of his wives illustrates his capacity for both passionate obsession and murderous violence, as he reportedly kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death during a domestic dispute, then mourned her so extravagantly that he had her body preserved and treated as if she were still alive, demonstrating the extreme emotional instability and violent tendencies that made him dangerous to anyone who came into close contact with him, regardless of their relationship or status. The emperor's financial irresponsibility was staggering in its scope and consequences, as he spent enormous sums on personal luxuries, public spectacles, and artistic projects while neglecting essential government functions and military defense, leading to a fiscal crisis that required increasingly desperate measures, including currency debasement, arbitrary taxation, and the confiscation of property from wealthy citizens through trumped-up charges and forced inheritances that undermined the rule of law and economic stability throughout the empire. The case of Nero's participation in the Olympic Games, where he competed in chariot racing and other events despite his obvious lack of athletic ability, reveals his desperate need for public validation and his willingness to corrupt even sacred institutions to feed his ego, as he was declared the winner of events he had not even completed, while judges were bribed or threatened to ensure his victory in competitions where his performance was laughably inadequate. The emperor's military incompetence became apparent during various crises that required decisive leadership and strategic thinking, as he consistently failed to respond effectively to rebellions, foreign invasions, and other threats to imperial security, while being more concerned with his artistic pursuits and personal pleasures than with the practical responsibilities of military command and strategic planning that were essential to maintaining the empire's stability and security. The case of the conspiracy led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso in 65 AD reveals the extent to which Nero's behavior had alienated even his closest supporters and advisors, as prominent senators, military officers, and court officials joined together in a desperate attempt to remove him from power before his continued rule could destroy the empire entirely. Though the conspiracy's failure led to a wave of executions and suicides that eliminated many of Rome's most capable leaders and further weakened the imperial government. The emperor's final years were characterized by increasing paranoia, isolation, and erratic behavior, as rebellions broke out across the empire and even the Praetorian Guard turned against him, leading to his eventual suicide in 68 AD, when he realized that his position had become untenable and that he faced certain execution if captured by his enemies. Though even in his final moments, he was reportedly more concerned with the artistic quality of his death than with the political and social chaos his reign had created. The long-term consequences of Nero's reign extended far beyond his own lifetime to influence Roman politics and society for generations, as his extreme behavior and institutional failures contributed to a period of civil war and political instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors, while his persecution of Christians helped to establish patterns of religious conflict that would persist for centuries, and his architectural projects and artistic pretensions set precedents for imperial excess that would influence subsequent rulers. The psychological analysis of Nero's character reveals a complex combination of narcissistic personality disorder, sadistic tendencies, and the corrupting effects of absolute power that began in adolescence and were exacerbated by the lack of effective constraints or guidance that might have channeled his impulses in more constructive directions, providing important insights into how early trauma, unlimited authority, and personality disorders can combine to create leaders who pose existential threats to the societies they govern. As we examine the full scope of Nero's destructive reign and its lasting impact on Roman civilization and subsequent history, it becomes clear that his case represents one of the most extreme examples of how personal pathology, unlimited power, and moral corruption can combine to create leadership that threatens the very foundations of civilized society, while leaving legacies of institutional damage and cultural trauma that persist long after the individual ruler's death and demonstrate the critical importance of institutional safeguards and moral constraints in preventing such catastrophic failures of leadership. Chapter 4. Ivan the Terrible, the paranoid Tsar who tortured his own people for sport. Ivan IV Vasilievich, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, began his reign as Grand Prince of Moscow in 1533 at the age of 3 and would eventually become the first Tsar of all Russia, initially showing promise as a ruler who might unite and modernize the fragmented Russian principalities. But over the course of his 51-year reign, this intelligent and capable leader would descend into a spiral of paranoid madness, sadistic cruelty, and institutional destruction that would transform him into one of history's most brutal tyrants, whose reign of terror would claim hundreds of thousands of lives while establishing patterns of autocratic rule and state violence that would plague Russian society for centuries and demonstrate how unchecked power and personal trauma can combine to create monsters who destroy the very foundations of civilized governance. The traumatic experiences of Ivan's childhood, including the death of his parents when he was still a young child, and his subsequent manipulation and abuse by competing noble factions who used him as a puppet while engaging in violent power struggles around him, created deep psychological wounds and a profound mistrust of human nature that would later manifest in his paranoid suspicions of betrayal and his conviction that extreme violence was the only reliable method of maintaining political control and personal security in a world where everyone was potentially an enemy seeking to destroy him. The case of Ivan's establishment of the Oprichniki, a secret police force that operated outside normal legal constraints and was given unlimited authority to identify and eliminate perceived enemies of the state, represents one of the earliest examples of systematic state terrorism in European history, as these black-clad horsemen were authorized to torture, murder, and confiscate property from anyone suspected of disloyalty while operating under Ivan's direct command and protection, creating a reign of terror that made every Russian citizen a potential victim of arbitrary violence and demonstrated how paranoid rulers could institutionalize cruelty and transform entire societies into instruments of oppression. The Oprichniki's methods of torture and execution were deliberately designed to maximize suffering and terror rather than simply eliminate perceived threats, as they employed techniques including impalement, flaying alive, boiling in oil, and feeding victims to wild animals while forcing family members and communities to witness these atrocities, creating a climate of fear so pervasive that it paralyzed normal social and economic activity while demonstrating Ivan's belief that extreme cruelty was not merely a tool of political control, but a form of entertainment that satisfied his sadistic psychological needs. The case of the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, where Ivan's forces systematically tortured and murdered thousands of innocent civilians based on unsubstantiated rumors of treason, illustrates the extreme paranoia and indiscriminate violence that characterized his later reign, as the Oprichniki spent 5 weeks methodically destroying one of Russia's most prosperous and culturally significant cities, while employing torture methods so creative and brutal that they shocked even hardened observers accustomed to medieval violence. The massacre eliminated not only suspected conspirators, but entire families, religious communities, and merchant classes that represented the economic and cultural foundation of Russian civilization. Ivan's treatment of the Russian Orthodox Church reveals his willingness to destroy even the most sacred institutions when they posed potential challenges to his absolute authority, as he systematically murdered clergy who criticized his policies, confiscated church property to fund his military campaigns, and forced religious leaders to participate in elaborate ceremonies that celebrated his divine right to rule while demonstrating his power over spiritual as well as temporal authority. His persecution of religious figures, who had previously enjoyed immunity from secular interference, established precedents for state control over religious institutions that would influence Russian politics for centuries. The case of Ivan's murder of his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, during a violent rage in 1581, represents the ultimate expression of his paranoid destructiveness and his inability to maintain normal human relationships even with his closest family members, as he struck down the young man who represented the future of his dynasty in a moment of uncontrolled fury that eliminated his most capable successor, while demonstrating that not even blood relationships could provide protection from his violent impulses and paranoid suspicions. The Tsar's sexual behavior was characterized by extreme depravity and violence that included the rape of noble women, the maintenance of a harem of kidnapped girls, and the practice of forcing his victims' families to witness their humiliation as a demonstration of his absolute power over his subjects' bodies and dignity. These sexual crimes were not private matters, but public demonstrations of dominance that were designed to break the spirit of the Russian aristocracy while satisfying Ivan's sadistic need for control and degradation. The case of Ivan's economic policies reveals his complete disregard for the welfare of his subjects and his willingness to destroy Russia's prosperity to fund his personal obsessions and military adventures, as he imposed crushing taxation, confiscated private property on a massive scale, and disrupted agricultural production through his reign of terror, creating famines and economic collapse that reduced much of the Russian population to subsistence living while generating resources that were squandered on pointless wars and personal luxuries. The Tsar's foreign policy was characterized by expensive and ultimately unsuccessful military campaigns that drained Russia's resources while accomplishing little beyond satisfying Ivan's personal ambitions for territorial expansion and international recognition, as his 25-year war in Livonia resulted in massive casualties and economic devastation, while failing to achieve its strategic objectives, demonstrating how personal obsessions could override rational assessments of national interests and military capabilities. The case of Ivan's architectural projects, including the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, reveals the contradiction between his capacity for cultural achievement and his destructive impulses, as he commissioned magnificent buildings and artworks while simultaneously destroying the human resources and economic foundations that made such achievements possible, creating a legacy of beautiful monuments built on foundations of mass murder and social destruction. The Tsar's judicial system was characterized by arbitrary cruelty and the complete abandonment of legal precedent or due process, as he regularly ordered executions based on dreams, omens, or imaginary offenses, while pardoning genuine criminals who amused him or served his immediate purposes, creating a legal environment where survival depended entirely on the ruler's unpredictable moods and paranoid fantasies, rather than any consistent application of law or justice. The case of Ivan's relationship with foreign diplomats and merchants reveals his erratic behavior and his tendency to alternate between grandiose hospitality and sudden violence, as he would lavishly entertain visiting dignitaries one day and threaten to have them executed the next, creating diplomatic crises that isolated Russia from potential allies while damaging trade relationships that were essential to the country's economic development and international standing. The Tsar's treatment of his own nobles and advisors demonstrates his complete inability to maintain stable political relationships or delegate authority effectively, as he systematically eliminated experienced administrators and military leaders through execution, exile, or forced monastic vows, while replacing them with incompetent favorites, whose only qualification was their willingness to participate in his reign of terror, creating a government apparatus that was incapable of effective administration or strategic planning. The case of Ivan's final years reveals a ruler who had become completely isolated from reality and was actively planning even more extreme measures against his own people, including the systematic elimination of entire social classes and the establishment of new forms of government based entirely on terror and arbitrary violence, while his physical and mental deterioration made him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous to anyone who came into contact with him. The long-term consequences of Ivan's reign extended far beyond his own lifetime to shape Russian political culture and social development for centuries, as his establishment of autocratic precedents and his destruction of independent institutions created patterns of authoritarian rule that would influence subsequent Russian leaders, while his reign of terror traumatized Russian society and created cultural attitudes toward authority and violence that would persist for generations. The psychological analysis of Ivan's character reveals a complex combination of childhood trauma, paranoid personality disorder, and the corrupting effects of absolute power that transformed a potentially capable ruler into a destructive force that threatened the survival of Russian civilization, providing important insights into how early psychological damage and unlimited authority can combine to create leaders who pose existential threats to their own societies. The international impact of Ivan's reign was largely negative, as his violent and unpredictable behavior isolated Russia from the broader European community, while his military failures and economic mismanagement weakened the country's position relative to its neighbors, creating vulnerabilities that would be exploited by foreign powers for decades, and demonstrating how individual pathology could undermine national security and international standing. As we examine the full scope of Ivan the Terrible's destructive reign and its lasting consequences for Russian society and European civilization, it becomes clear that his case represents one of the most extreme examples of how personal trauma, unlimited power, and institutional weakness can combine to create catastrophic leadership that destroys the very foundations of civilized society while establishing precedents for authoritarian rule and state violence that continue to influence political development centuries after the individual ruler's death. Chapter 5. Vlad the Impaler, the blood-soaked prince who turned torture into art. Vlad III. Dracula, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, ruled Wallachia in the 15th century during one of the most turbulent periods in Eastern European history, when the expanding Ottoman Empire threatened to engulf the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans, and survival required both military skill and political ruthlessness. But even in this context of endemic warfare and brutal politics, Vlad's methods of maintaining power and dealing with enemies were so extreme and sadistic that they shocked contemporary observers and created a legend of cruelty that would inspire centuries of horror stories, while demonstrating how the pursuit of political survival could transform a human being into a monster whose capacity for inflicting suffering exceeded the bounds of rational strategic thinking or basic human decency. The traumatic experiences of Vlad's youth, including his imprisonment by the Ottoman Empire as a hostage to ensure his father's loyalty and his exposure to the sophisticated torture techniques employed by the Turkish court, created psychological wounds and a familiarity with extreme violence that would later manifest in his own innovative approaches to torture and execution, as he learned firsthand how pain and terror could be used as instruments of political control while developing a personal, fascination with suffering that would eventually consume his entire approach to governance and human relationships. The case of Vlad's signature method of execution, impalement, reveals both his creativity in devising new forms of torture and his understanding of how extreme cruelty could serve as a deterrent to potential enemies and rebels, as he perfected techniques for inserting wooden stakes through victims' bodies in ways that would maximize their suffering while keeping them alive for hours or even days, creating forests of dying people whose screams and agony served as warnings to anyone who might consider opposing his rule or challenging his authority. The scale of Vlad's use of impalement was unprecedented in medieval warfare and politics, as historical records suggest that he may have impaled over 20,000 people during his relatively brief periods of rule, including not only enemy soldiers and political opponents, but also merchants, peasants, and clergy who had committed minor offenses or simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time when the prince was in need of victims to satisfy his sadistic impulses and demonstrate his power over life and death. The case of the famous dinner party, where Vlad entertained guests while surrounded by hundreds of impaled victims, demonstrates his psychological need to combine social normalcy with extreme violence, as he reportedly enjoyed elaborate meals and conversations while the screams and moans of dying people provided a soundtrack to his hospitality, revealing a personality that derived pleasure not merely from inflicting pain, but from the juxtaposition of civilized behavior and barbaric cruelty that demonstrated his complete control over both life and death. Vlad's treatment of the Ottoman ambassadors who came to demand tribute illustrates his willingness to risk military catastrophe to satisfy his personal need for dominance and humiliation, as he reportedly had their turbans nailed to their heads when they refused to remove them in his presence, creating a diplomatic incident that would lead to massive Ottoman retaliation, while demonstrating that his sadistic impulses often overrode rational considerations of political and military strategy. The case of Vlad's persecution of the Saxon merchants in Transylvania reveals how his cruelty extended beyond military and political enemies to include entire ethnic and economic groups that he viewed as threats to his power or obstacles to his ambitions, as he systematically tortured and murdered German-speaking traders and craftsmen while confiscating their property and destroying their communities, creating economic disruption that weakened his own territories while satisfying his xenophobic hatred and his need for victims to torture. The prince's methods of torture extended far beyond impalement to include a comprehensive repertoire of techniques designed to maximize suffering and terror, including flaying alive, boiling in oil, cutting off limbs one by one, and forcing victims to eat parts of their own bodies. While he reportedly observed these proceedings with evident pleasure and often participated personally in the torture process, demonstrating a level of hands-on sadism that went far beyond the normal requirements of medieval political violence. The case of Vlad's treatment of his own boyars and nobles reveals his paranoid suspicions of the aristocratic class that had traditionally shared power with Wallachian rulers, as he systematically eliminated potential rivals through elaborate torture sessions that served both to remove political threats and to satisfy his psychological need for dominance and control, creating a political vacuum that weakened his own government while demonstrating his preference for personal gratification over effective administration. The prince's military tactics incorporated torture and terror as strategic weapons designed to demoralize enemy forces and civilian populations, as he would impale captured soldiers in full view of besieged cities while sending the severed heads of enemy commanders to opposing armies, creating psychological warfare that was often more effective than conventional military force, while revealing his understanding of how extreme cruelty could serve practical political and military objectives. The case of Vlad's relationship with the Orthodox Church demonstrates his willingness to use religious authority to legitimize his cruelty while simultaneously threatening clergy who opposed his methods, as he claimed divine sanction for his actions while forcing priests to participate in ceremonies that blessed his torture devices and celebrated his victories over impaled enemies, creating a perverted form of religious justification for behavior that violated every principle of Christian morality and human decency. The prince's domestic policies were characterized by arbitrary violence and economic disruption that reflected his inability to distinguish between legitimate governance and personal sadism, as he would order mass executions for minor infractions while implementing tax policies through torture and intimidation that destroyed agricultural productivity and commercial activity throughout his territories, demonstrating how personal pathology could undermine the basic functions of government and social order. The case of Vlad's treatment of foreign visitors and diplomats reveals his need to demonstrate his power through displays of cruelty that often backfired by creating international isolation and military alliances against him, as his reputation for extreme violence made him a pariah among European rulers who might otherwise have supported his resistance to Ottoman expansion, showing how personal sadism could override strategic considerations and damage vital political relationships. The prince's final military campaigns were characterized by increasingly desperate and brutal tactics that reflected his growing isolation and his recognition that his methods had created more enemies than allies, as he resorted to scorched earth policies and mass civilian massacres that weakened his own position while failing to achieve decisive military victories, demonstrating how a strategy based primarily on terror and cruelty could ultimately prove self-defeating, even in the brutal context of medieval warfare. The case of Vlad's death in 1476, reportedly killed by his own men, who had grown weary of his cruelty and unpredictability, illustrates how extreme sadism could ultimately alienate even those who benefited from a ruler's protection, as his bodyguards and supporters apparently concluded that he posed a greater threat to their survival than his enemies did, showing how personal pathology could destroy the loyalty and trust that were essential to maintaining political power in any historical context. The long-term legacy of Vlad's reign extends far beyond his immediate historical impact to influence literature, popular culture, and political discourse for over 5 centuries, as his methods and personality became the inspiration for the Dracula legend, while his approach to governance provided a template for subsequent dictators and tyrants who sought to use extreme violence as a tool of political control, demonstrating how individual pathology could have cultural and political consequences that persist long after the original perpetrator's death. The psychological analysis of Vlad's character reveals a complex combination of childhood trauma, sadistic personality disorder, and the specific historical circumstances of 15th century Balkan politics that created conditions where extreme violence could be rationalized as political necessity while serving deeper psychological needs for dominance and control, providing insights into how environmental factors and individual pathology can combine to create leaders whose cruelty exceeds any rational political or military requirements. The military and political context of Vlad's reign, including the constant threat of Ottoman invasion and the fragmented nature of Wallachian political institutions, helps to explain how his extreme methods could initially appear effective while ultimately proving counterproductive, as his reputation for cruelty did deter some enemies while creating others, and his destruction of domestic institutions weakened his ability to sustain long-term resistance to foreign conquest. As we examine the full scope of Vlad the Impaler's brutal reign and its lasting impact on European history and culture, it becomes clear that his case represents one of the most extreme examples of how personal sadism and political violence can become indistinguishable, creating leadership that serves individual psychological needs rather than rational political objectives, while establishing precedents for state-sponsored cruelty that continue to influence discussions of political power and human rights in contemporary society. Chapter 6: King John of England, the coward who lost an empire and destroyed medieval honor. John Lackland, who became King of England in 1199 after the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart, inherited one of the most powerful and extensive kingdoms in medieval Europe, controlling not only England but also vast territories in France that made the English crown one of the dominant forces in European politics. But through a combination of military incompetence, political cowardice, financial irresponsibility and moral corruption, this weak and treacherous ruler would lose most of his French possessions, alienate his own nobles, and create constitutional crises that would fundamentally alter the relationship between monarchy and aristocracy in England, while establishing himself as one of history's most despised and ineffective kings, whose failures would have consequences that extended far beyond his own reign. The king's military incompetence became apparent almost immediately after his accession to the throne, as he proved incapable of defending the extensive Angevin territories that his predecessors had built through conquest and strategic marriage, losing Normandy, Anjou, and most of his other French possessions to Philip Augustus of France through a series of humiliating defeats that demonstrated his complete inability to understand military strategy, inspire loyalty among his troops, or maintain the alliances that were essential to defending his scattered territories against determined enemies. The case of John's loss of Normandy in 1204 represents one of the most catastrophic military and political failures in English medieval history, as he abandoned his ancestral duchy without mounting an effective defense, leaving his Norman vassals to face French conquest while he fled to England, destroying centuries of political and cultural connections between England and continental Europe, while demonstrating a level of cowardice and incompetence that shocked contemporary observers and permanently damaged the prestige of the English crown. The king's treatment of his nephew Arthur of Brittany, who had a legitimate claim to the English throne and represented a potential rallying point for opposition to John's rule, illustrates his capacity for both political calculation and personal cruelty, as he reportedly murdered the young man with his own hands after capturing him during a military campaign, eliminating a rival while creating a scandal that alienated potential allies and provided his enemies with propaganda that portrayed him as a kinslayer who violated the most basic codes of medieval honor and family loyalty. The case of John's conflict with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury reveals his stubborn refusal to accept legitimate authority when it conflicted with his personal interests, leading to a papal interdict that closed all churches in England for 6 years and excommunicated the king himself, creating a religious and political crisis that weakened his position domestically while providing his enemies with additional justification for opposing his rule on both political and spiritual grounds. The king's financial policies were characterized by desperate attempts to raise money through increasingly arbitrary and oppressive taxation that violated traditional feudal obligations and legal precedents, as he imposed excessive scutage payments, manipulated the judicial system to generate revenue through fines and forfeitures, and sold royal offices to the highest bidders regardless of their qualifications, creating a system of government that served primarily to extract wealth from his subjects rather than to provide effective administration or military protection. The case of John's treatment of the English barons reveals his inability to maintain the delicate balance of mutual obligation and respect that characterized successful medieval kingship, as he consistently violated feudal customs, confiscated property without legal justification, and demanded military service and financial payments that exceeded traditional limits, creating resentment and opposition among the very people whose support was essential to maintaining royal authority and defending the kingdom against external threats. The king's personal behavior was characterized by sexual depravity and moral corruption that violated medieval standards of royal dignity and Christian virtue, as he reportedly seduced the wives and daughters of his own nobles, maintained multiple mistresses while married, and engaged in other forms of sexual misconduct that scandalized his court and provided his enemies with additional evidence of his unfitness to rule a Christian kingdom, demonstrating how personal immorality could undermine political authority and social stability. The case of John's surrender to Philip Augustus and his acceptance of vassal status for his remaining French territories represents one of the most humiliating diplomatic failures in English history, as he acknowledged French suzerainty over lands that his predecessors had held as independent sovereigns, destroying the international prestige of the English crown, while demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice national honor and territorial integrity to preserve his personal position and avoid military confrontation. The king's judicial policies were characterized by corruption and arbitrary decision-making that undermined the rule of law and created a system where justice could be purchased by the highest bidder, while legal precedents were ignored in favor of decisions that served the king's immediate financial or political interests, destroying public confidence in royal justice while creating grievances that would eventually contribute to the baronial rebellion that forced him to accept constitutional limitations on royal power. The case of the Magna Carta, which John was forced to sign in 1215 after his barons rebelled against his arbitrary rule, represents both the culmination of his failures as a king and the beginning of constitutional government in England, as the document established principles of limited monarchy and legal due process that would influence political development for centuries, while demonstrating that even medieval kings could be held accountable for their actions when they violated fundamental principles of justice and good governance. The king's attempts to repudiate the Magna Carta immediately after signing it reveal his complete lack of honor and his inability to accept constitutional constraints on his authority, as he sought papal support for annulling the agreement while hiring foreign mercenaries to fight against his own barons, creating a civil war that devastated England while demonstrating his willingness to destroy his own kingdom rather than accept limitations on his power or acknowledge his subjects' rights. The case of John's death in 1216, reportedly from dysentery contracted during his military campaigns against the rebellious barons, came at a moment when his kingdom was torn apart by civil war and foreign invasion, with French forces occupying much of eastern England, while his own nobles had invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne, creating a situation where the monarchy's survival depended entirely on the loyalty of a few remaining supporters and the political skills of the regents who would govern for his young son, Henry III. The long-term consequences of John's reign extended far beyond his own lifetime to fundamentally alter the nature of English kingship and constitutional development, as the precedents established by the Magna Carta would be invoked by subsequent generations of political reformers, while the institutional weaknesses exposed by his failures would lead to ongoing conflicts between monarchy and parliament that would shape English political evolution for centuries. The international impact of John's reign was largely negative, as his military failures and diplomatic incompetence weakened England's position in European politics, while his loss of the French territories eliminated the continental connections that had made the English crown a major player in European affairs, creating an insularity that would influence English foreign policy and cultural development for generations. The psychological analysis of John's character reveals a combination of insecurity, cowardice, and moral weakness that made him fundamentally unsuited for the demands of medieval kingship, as he lacked the military courage, political wisdom, and personal integrity that were essential for maintaining authority and respect in a society where leadership was based on personal relationships and demonstrated competence rather than abstract legal principles or institutional authority. The case of John's relationship with his brother Richard the Lionheart, whom he had betrayed during the Third Crusade and whose death may have been hastened by John's political machinations, illustrates his capacity for treachery and his willingness to sacrifice family loyalty for personal advantage, establishing patterns of behavior that would characterize his entire reign and contribute to his reputation as one of history's most untrustworthy and dishonorable rulers. As we examine the full scope of King John's catastrophic reign and its lasting consequences for English constitutional development and European political history, it becomes clear that his case represents one of the most dramatic examples of how individual incompetence and moral failure can create institutional changes that extend far beyond the original ruler's intentions or lifetime, demonstrating how even failed leadership can have profound historical significance when it exposes fundamental weaknesses in political systems and forces societies to develop new mechanisms for controlling arbitrary power and protecting individual rights.